house, and if any Indian tries to stop me, I'll blast him.
You know, the only thing more pathetic than Indians on TV is Indians watching Indians on TV.
What the heck is Indians.com? Who the heck is Acee Agoyo? If you're asking yourself that question, I don't blame you. I didn't know Acee Agoyo until, a month ago. I met him on Clubhouse. He's a very impressive individual, one of the co-founding members of Indians.com. It's an online native news source, and he was doing a lot of things that I saw with this podcast. Saw a void, saw an opportunity to fill it, and he just did it. And for the past 21 years, he's been reporting out on native news, being a journalist, focusing on native representation in media, but highlighting the stories that don't get covered by mainstream media. His frustration with mainstream media was it was all reactive news. There was nothing looking into the happenings, just the everyday happenings across Indian country. And he does, in the course of his journalism work, come across native film and television, and he reports out on that. People on his staff report out on that. So he's just an impressive individual that I met on Clubhouse, and I'm just like, dude, you're freaking awesome. Can you just come on? And at this point, I've talked with Acee just dozens of hours, I would say. Maybe not dozens, but definitely hours upon hours for sure, because in Clubhouse it's just long form conversation. You're just hanging out, you're talking, and we just pick each other's brains on different topics throughout this interview, but throughout our friendship. And I would call it a friendship at this point because we really do lean on each other for different types of knowledge bases, and we just have great conversations. And I look forward to working with Acee in the future and being a collaborative partner as much as possible. And really, I'm just excited to know somebody like him because, man, he's just an impressive individual. When you hear him speak in this interview, you'll definitely agree with me. We cover a variety of topics throughout this interview, but one of which I want to pick his brain about how the landscape has changed with native representation in film and television over the past 21 years, and how our participation at the different levels of film and television, both behind the camera and in front of the camera, have changed and in some ways have stayed stagnant. So I hope everyone enjoys the conversation, and we'll be back next week with another interview. We will be talking about Real Engine with another native podcast, actually twin native podcasters. All right, everybody, y'all have a good one. So first of all, Acee, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really wanted to get you on to talk about really your experience being a native journalist, covering, the vast majority of things in native news, but some of that is native representation in film. And I just wanted to see also, just as a journalist, how has the landscape changed of native film and television throughout your career? And so before we got started, you kind of went on and told me about how the website Indians.com got founded and how long you've been in journalism. So I apologize. Could you repeat what you just mentioned?
Oh, yeah, of course. So Indians.com started in August of 1999. I'm one of the three co-founders of the website. The other co-founder is Mia Merrick, and the third co-founder is Todd York. And of those three, Todd York, he's still with the company, and Mia Merrick is no longer with the company. And we started it because we looked at the other websites that were out there that were focusing on native issues, and there were basically none. At the time, there was a website called pachanga.net, and that was started by a friend of mine named Victor, whose name is Victor Roca. And he started it because the Pachanga band of Luiseño Indians in California was facing a huge public campaign that they needed to address gaming issues. So he really brought the spotlight to Indian gaming in Indian country. And there were basically no other websites besides him and Indian Country Today, which at the time was independently owned Indian website, newspaper and website. So we decided, well,
that's crazy. We have like over 560 native nations and like 2 news sources to cover all of that.
Yeah, and that's sadly the history of how it's always been. The mainstream media does not cover Indian issues with regularity, and when they do, it's usually a reactionary story. It's usually the battles between Indians and non-Indians, and it's usually a person who doesn't like Indians that's really the focus of the story. And so the reason why myself and my co-founders decided to do this was to say, we're Native people. Each of our tribes and nations has a history of storytelling, and let's talk about that and let's bring that forward. And storytelling comes in many forms. It's not just news. We've had a history of news, but its storytelling is oral history. It's songs, it's video, it's film, it's television. It's a lot of different things.
So let's give listeners a little bit of background about who you are. So you're Acee Agoyo, but and then you are a journalist, co-founder of Indians.com. But what else are you? Like of whatever you would like to share.
Yeah, so my name is Acee Agoyo, and I'm from Okeowinge, which is a tribe in northern New Mexico, and I was raised there, and that's the tribe of my father. My father was the former governor of the tribe, and he held a lot of other leadership positions within our tribe and among the Pueblo people in New Mexico. I'm also from Coche de Pueblo and Kiwa, which are my mother's tribes, and they're also located in New Mexico. So both my parents are from Pueblo communities in New Mexico.
That's great. I hope to be invited to a feast day at some point. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I mean, every feast has been canceled in 2020. So
I'm sure.
Hopefully, once more people get vaccinated and everybody is safe, we can do that again, because gatherings are part of our tradition, and songs and getting together. That is our storytelling, and that is our media.
Well, and I'm sure you've written stories, or someone has at least documented that aspect, right? At some point, in some form, at least the importance of maintaining culture through the pandemic.
Oh yeah, definitely. One of the major issues that we've seen is the loss of language and the loss of culture barriers. The Cherokee Nation, for example, in Oklahoma, they've lost a number of their fluent speakers, and most of them are elderly. And so without those people being in the community and being able to pass on the language, it really is devastating. And among the Pueblos in northern New Mexico, we also lost a language teacher, and she was a teacher in one of the high schools. So without someone like that, even in our school system, it is going to be harder for younger kids to learn their own language.
Well, I think what's hard about what I love about your website and is you cover, like when I look at your articles, I'm like, this is nowhere else. You go to any other major news outlet, CNN, Fox, AP, Associated Press, or whatever. Like you go to any of those, they're all just kind of regurgitating the same story. Whereas yours is like the only place to go for this news. And I think that's what I appreciate the most about your website. And I'm glad that it's out there. I mean, there's so many, and there's so many stories not being covered. When people talk to you about Indians.com, is there something you wish people would ask more about?
I wish that people would realize that every tribal community has something to say. And by that, I mean, we need to really encourage our younger people to get involved in spreading whatever that story is. My parents' generation, they were kind of told over and over to be involved in education. So a lot of them are teachers. Both of my parents were teachers. And a lot of people of that generation, they were told, yeah, go to school, and they ended up being in education. The following generation, they were told, we have to fight for our rights. So we have a lot of lawyers. We have a ton of Indian teachers, a ton of Indian lawyers, and then we need that in other areas. We need that in health. There's very few Native doctors. We need to get more Native doctors to serve not just our people, but to serve elsewhere. And then we need more people telling our stories. So tribes should encourage and tribes should use their backgrounds, their traditions, and say to their young people, let's pass this on. And you can do that maybe by being a journalist or a writer or a music producer or a video producer. There are many ways to do it. And each community obviously will have the ability to do that for themselves and decide what that looks like.
When you're looking at So the focus of this podcast is Native representation in film and television, obviously. But Native representation just as a whole, there's a history of misrepresentation in this country. How has that, like starting Indians.com, was your intent to add visibility to Native issues or to start telling it from an accurate lens? How much of it was that, I guess?
I think it's both. I mean, you
Okay.
have to have the truth, and the truth has not always been kind to Indian country. And by that, you can go to newspapers in the 1800s, especially in the late 1800s, and they actively called for our genocide. I mean, there's newspaper editorials and stories that would say, kill the Indians. And there were ads that were placed and run in newspapers that said, if you kill an Indian, you can get money for it. So there's a history of accuracy that we need to overcome. And the second part of that is that we are in charge of our own destiny, and we're sovereign. We live on sovereign nations. We determine our own future, and we should be in charge of telling that story. And every community should decide how they want to do that for themselves. So I think it's both. You need both accuracy, and then you need to come from your place of your history, whether it's your own specific tribe or maybe your urban Indian community, because urban Indian communities are also very important. So those stories need to come from the people who know it best. I mean, we wouldn't accept this almost anywhere else. You wouldn't want someone who doesn't have the knowledge and connections and expertise, but for some reason, the mainstream media feels that they don't need it when they talk about Indian country, that they can talk about us from a distance, or they can talk about it in terms of somebody who doesn't like us. So you'll see a lot of stories where there's people who just don't like what a tribe is doing, and that's the story. That's really the story. Is that
Wow.
really any different from calling for us to be killed?
That's an interesting parallel, because I think a lot of us that aren't really plugged into mainstream media because we are in our communities, or we kind of just are so connected to our community news, don't see that message that's spread to everyone that is non-native. So I think that's a great perspective. I'd be interested to see what the dialogue is, looking at the evolution of like native mascots and the conversation, how it's changed to now where people are finally seeing, oh, this is a problem, because I had Charlene Teeters on maybe a dozen episodes ago. That was a great episode because she gleaned insight from one, living it. But I think the most profound thing that she said to me was, by being able to diminish somebody's being into a caricature, you're able to dehumanize them to the degree that it becomes okay to put them on reservations and continue to take lands and resources from them, and to continue to not listen to their stories and not value their perspective. So I think something like Indians.com is great because, man, it's like finally giving us our voice and a platform to just say, I mean, for the past 21 years, you've been doing that and you'll continue to do that. But does that ever resonate with you of like, I guess, like, what is the continued vision of Indians.com?
I think that really is something that resonates with me. There have been a lot of changes in how we are portrayed in the media in my lifetime, and there's been a lot of changes in society just in my lifetime. One of the biggest issues that I learned about when I was still in college was the Supreme Court's decisions that are racist against us. They're built on a foundation not of law, not of anything written in the law, but this idea that our people are less than. And so within just the past 15 years, people in our communities have been able to almost overturn one of those negative decisions. And that's only happened because we are out there telling our stories. We are sending our people to Capitol Hill, and then I'm there to cover it and let other people know that this is actually what's happening.
Do people come to you for answers as a journalist, even though you're just reporting? But you know so much more than I think the everyday person, just by virtue of your job.
No, they don't, and I'm happy they don't, because the non-Indian world loves to ask other people what their thoughts are, and that means they want you to tell them what you know. And if you want to know what I know, you have to read the website. That's just my work comes out and what's put on the website. And I don't do. I know there's a lot of people who do speaking engagements, or they work with organizations. I don't do that because that takes a lot of time. But if I did, I'd want to be paid for that, and we should all be compensated for any kind of work we do. So if I had more time, I probably would do it, but I'm glad they don't, because then I would just be overwhelmed with them asking me, well, what about this? And the problem with that is, I view things from how it affects Indian country. I don't view things necessarily, why is this important to a person out in a specific place? So a lot of the stories are based on policy and law and policy, and the court decisions that come out of our courts, the decisions that are made in Congress, the decisions that are made in our executive branch, they affect everybody. And that's where the focus is on, at least from my perspective. I can't be an expert on some community that I'm not from. And sadly, that's what non-Indians often want. They want either you to be that expert on a community that they are thinking about, or they want you to sanction their behavior in order for them to say, oh, I spoke to so-and-so and they said what I'm doing is good, so that must mean I'm right. And then you can never question what I'm doing.
I always try to articulate what you just said in a few words, which really they want to find someone to sanction their beliefs or actions. And that is so profound to me, because that's so true. As a Native person, I mentioned it in a couple episodes ago, of just like, it sucks to be the representative for an entire, not even your own race of people, because like Native American, just a big umbrella term, but like, it's not even like, hey, Ian, what do Navajos think about this? It's like, what do natives think about this massive issue that is like, has varied perspectives across the entire 570, 60 Native nations? Can you tell me your opinion? And, you're probably the only person that they're going to ask. And so you have to either back out, like kind of have a PC answer, or say something and just know that they're probably never going to ask anybody else, or they'll challenge you on your belief. Like they know, like they come from a place of knowledge. And so I think it definitely speaks to the difficulty of accurate representation, because there are so many varied perspectives. Even you as a Native person, that there's no way you could speak for any other tribe, really, just outside of your family. You're like, well, I can speak for my family and my community, but that's probably about it. And even then, me personally, I don't live in my community anymore. So the issues that were relevant, the perspectives that were there when I was living there 10, 15 years ago, probably have changed a little bit. So my feelings and perspectives might not even be representative of my community as it is today. But in Hollywood and journalism and media, it seems we have it's not even a close enough. It's just like, hey, we check the box, we talk to a Native person, we're good. How do we progress to advance the conversation to get people to realize, like, hey, there's a lot of people out there, that a lot of different perspectives and experiences that are so diverse and can't be encapsulated in just one person's response?
That's a really huge question, because it takes work. And you hear a lot of people now, one of the common phrases you hear is to do the work, and work is hard. I spoke with a Native author this morning, and she said it took her a year and a half to kind of figure out what she was doing in terms of her personal finances. And that's a lot of work to have to spend. And it's going to take that amount of work for all of us to do that sort of thing with different communities that we want to engage with. But if you don't want to engage with anybody, then that's fine. But if you say you want to, and if you say you care about Native issues, you actually have to go to Native people and ask them. And you can't just go to the biggest place, and you shouldn't also go to the smallest place. You should just look at different views. I mean, the tribes in the Northeast, for example, especially in New England, nobody almost ever asks them anything. So when I went to college in Massachusetts, luckily I was able to meet a lot of them. And one of the tribes, which is the Narragansett tribe in Rhode Island, their court case became one of the most important in recent history. And if I hadn't been there to watch it and to tell people what happened, I don't think the mainstream media would have cared about it. And
what court case are you speaking of?
Also, the United States Supreme Court ruled that a tribe cannot reclaim its land unless they were, quote, under federal jurisdiction in 1934.
Wow.
And that really has affected a lot of tribes, because the federal government has engaged with Native nations in different ways. Some of them signed treaties, some of them did not sign treaties, but they were engaged with the government on various levels. And that means, quote unquote, they're recognized as on a sovereign to sovereign level. But in some cases, because of history of racism and a lot of other issues, it takes longer for the United States to say, oh yeah, we knew you there all along, and we're just formally recognizing that. So, tribes have been here since time immemorial. Their sovereignty is inherent and their existence is inherent, and that doesn't depend on anybody else. However, in order to really exercise and your sovereignty and engage in self-determination, there has to be a recognition by other nations. And the United States is very slow to do that. So because it's slow to do that, there are dozens of tribes who aren't able to acquire land without having to jump through additional hoops. And there are so many bureaucratic levels of craziness that you have to go through. And specifically, the Narragansett tribe can never do that again. They were barred by the Supreme Court from acquiring lands, and they're the only tribe in the United States that is discriminated against in that fashion.
Wow. Well, so you were saying if their recognition does not predate 1937, then they were not allowed to.
1934.
1934, thank you.
Yeah, 1934 was the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act. And that act ended what we knew as allotment. And allotment was a very destructive policy where they took our land even further and divvied it out to people, and the rest they just gave away to non-Indians.
And the Dawes Allotment Act is what you're referring to, correct?
Yes, that was a period between 1887 and 1934 where 90 million acres of Indian land was lost. So in 1934, that's picked as the starting date because that was Congress's intention to say, hey, we're stopping this. And, let's give the land back to the people who originally owned it. And because of this case, which is probably one of the worst in the past 20 years, a lot of tribes are stuck in limbo, and they have to go through additional steps even to get their land back.
Well, in the past, there's always been people that have claimed native heritage when they see the benefit, whether it's dividends or some kind of per cap, some kind of financial or resource benefit. And the Dawes Allotment Act, with this whole pretendians controversy that has been looming in the news, I didn't know this, but it makes sense that there were a lot of non-native people that wanted to get land basically granted to them. And so they would claim, native heritage at the time, and they were given some of the parsec of land that was allotted to the native people back then.
Yeah, there's very specific instances of that. The governor of Oklahoma, whose name is Kevin Stitt, he's a member of the Republican Party. He's also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And High Country News and New York Times went in and discovered that the ancestor that he's descended from was enrolled against the objections of the Cherokee Nation. And it was basically fraudulent. So we're talking about a family that was given land. They were given allotments, and they were recognized as citizens of the Cherokee Nation. And the Cherokee Nation doesn't engage in disenrollment, so they're not going to kick Kevin Stitt out. Mm-hmm. But that kind of idea that you can come in and say, I'm Indian because I want land, that's been part of our history for hundreds of years.
When there are people I've met throughout my life that now it's all about genealogy, 23andMe, and you send in like a cheek swab, and then your DNA essentially, and they run whatever tests they run. They send you back a printout of where your ancestry hails from. And there have been instances where I've seen where people would be like, hey, Ian, I got my 23andMe results, and, I'm 2% Native American or 3% Native American. Is there any money in that? Or can I get free healthcare? Where can I get enrolled? Is there... Where do you think that comes from for individuals to think that just because a printout says you have a certain percentage that you are entitled to a certain degree to find out how you can reap benefit from that? When there's 98% of them that's something else, but that 2% they see and they're like, oh, I'm entitled to benefit because of that. And they look at you as though you are reaping some kind of benefit.
It goes back to what we talked about earlier, and it goes back to outsiders wanting us to sanction their actions. So when a person discovers that they might have a native ancestor, that kind of allows them to absolve themselves of what has happened to us. It allows them to say, well, I can't be all that bad, and our country can't be all that bad if my great, 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 great grandfather, or even further back, had a child with an Indian woman. So it allows them not only to claim part of our sovereignty, but it allows them to say, oh, the system that we live under now, which is colonialization, I'm not a part of that. I don't play a role in that. So you can't blame me. And if there are more and more people who say that, then they can say that system no longer exists, because then they can say they're just us. So what makes us different from them? And that really is this fight between who gets to say who belongs. Is it ourselves or is it somebody else? And somebody else, if somebody else gets to decide, then we've lost our identity. We've lost our sovereignty.
And that issue in itself gets so divisive because of all of divisive even just amongst Indian country, because of how we've all gotten, because of our unique relationships with the United States government, the unique relationships with neighboring communities, where we ended up, and predating, colonialization. So it's like predating contact, post-contact, and post, I guess, like government policy imposition on us. It's like, how do you reconcile that as a community without ostracizing people who rightfully should be in your community?
Yeah, that's such a fascinating question. And I've discovered that it's very common now in my part of New Mexico for people to discover or claim that they belong to a certain tribe, or that they think they belong to a certain tribe. So the history of New Mexico, it dates back to the early arrival of colonists from Spain, and they've settled there over 400 years ago. My tribe, Okewinge, we were actually the first capital of New Spain. And so there's a long history of two different peoples, which is Spain, they're a nation, and they came and settled among our nations. So I was speaking to a genealogist who tells me she said she gets so inundated by requests from people who have long considered themselves to be Spanish descended, and they find a record that their grandmother was married at a church that happened to be at a pueblo. And she has to tell them, back in those days, there was only one church, and it was almost always at the pueblo, because it was part of the mission of the Spanish government to convert all of us. So where's the church going to be in the 1700s? It's going to be at the pueblo. Where was your ancestor going to get married? It's going to be at the pueblo. Where were they baptized? It's at the pueblo. So she has to tell them, just because there's this record, that's not it. It's more than a geography. It has to be, do you actually come from the community or not? And most of the time she tells them, unless there's more information, there's no proof that you come from that community.
And they'll cherry pick moments in history. They won't advance further and go to the Pueblo Revolt and realize, like, oh, all of that was coming to a head. There was a big issue stemming, and there was a big issue like across a lot of that territory that that's frustrating. I don't really know what else to say, because that those questions don't stop. Like, and I don't know how to tell people, like, that question made me uncomfortable, because it's like, it never comes from a random person. It's always like, at least in my experience, it's always someone I know pretty well. So I'm like, how do I tell them politely that was probably one of the weirdest questions you could have ever asked me, and I don't know where that, because it's on a piece of paper, now I have to ask somebody about this. But it goes to what you're saying. They want to sanction their beliefs and their actions.
Yeah, I mean, it's tied into this idea that there's a history of promises that were written down to our nations, and we want them upheld, and we want the true recognition of our sovereignty. And that means more than just pieces of paper. The way a lot of people will want to view tribes is that we're little clubs, and we're not. But a lot of Indian law and policy, it actually is based on that premise that we're just nothing but a club. So it takes more than that. It takes a recognition that our sovereignty is inherent, and we decide what happens on our own lands. And it's not difficult for the United States to deal with that, because slowly we get, depending on who's in charge of the presidency and who's in the White House, it's a little bit different. So now we're under the current new president, we have a different change. He's saying we're working on a nation-to-nation basis. And so for a president to say that, yes, you are a nation, that's a big deal.
It's a big deal. And to go back to your club comment, it's almost like this, like natives or fraternities in a way, or these like societies where there needs to be a rite of passage. I know for a while there was a big trend of like these Indian summer camps where it was like no natives. It was just a bunch of like random, non-native kids. And they would just go to these summer camps, and it would just be these caricatures of our culture. And they would just be these gross misrepresentations. And there's movies about that. And there's like to show how acceptable it was, because of like, oh, this is fun, like Man of the House comes to mind. But there's just so many instances of the Heavyweights with Ben Stiller. That was another one. Their camp was all like, was an Indian summer camp. So I wanted to ask you too, to bring this back around to film. You had proposed a question, which I think is a great standing question for guests coming in, of what is your first movie memory?
Yeah, and the reason I thought of this is that, we all have different ways that we were brought up. And sometimes, it's good to share those experiences. I was in a talk with another person, and he was explaining how he started a website. And to hear that from another person, it's just, to me, it's fascinating. So for, you doing native film, I think that's such a fascinating question to ask native people. What's your first film memory? So for me, I so remember it vividly. I came from a large family. I have 5 brothers and sisters. And when you have a lot of siblings, there's a lot of, you can have a little bit of competition now and then. And you can't always take every child to the movies. So my parents in 1977, after the first Star Wars came out, my mom, I could tell she was up to something. She packed a little bag and she was putting like food in it, like treats. I'm like, well, what is she doing? And she said, we're going. And I said, okay. So she took me and it was me, my dad, and my mom. She took us to the nearest movie theater, which is actually on our reservation, but the town is controlled by non-Indians. And that was the only movie theater. And next door, there was a drive-in, but the drive-in is seasonal. So we went to the movie theater, and the first movie memory that I remember being, about 4 or 5 years old, was watching Star Wars. So to me, that was such a big deal, to be part of the little secret that, my mom had to sneak me out so that the rest of the kids wouldn't know where we were going. And then I got to see Star Wars, and Star Wars is so iconic for a lot of Native people. To me, Star Wars is the original Star Wars, and I know that could be controversial for some people, but the characters that were in the first 3 Star Wars, I think a lot of them speak to Native people. And I
agree.
And so when I was thinking about that, and I really was wanting to understand, well, why was that memory so important to me? And I think it's because I was able to experience that, and I was able to experience such a great start of a movie franchise, which is the Star Wars franchise.
That's so great. Yeah, there's a lot of parallels between, just the Jedi culture and like native culture, and that how it's so. I just love how that immediately natives, we see it, and obviously that representation wasn't intended at all. But we can just but I think it speaks also to just how little we are on screen, that we see something even remotely resembling who we are. We're like, oh, I'll take that.
Yeah, we got to grab at it.
We got to take that. Yeah. That's great. And that's evident in The Mandalorian right now. It's evident throughout my lifetime, movies like Selena and La Bamba, where we're like brown people that are accurately represented on screen, blood in, blood out, Stand and Deliver. We're just like, I'll take it. Boys in the Hood, I'll take it. These are great stories that I can see myself in, and I can see some of my experiences and people that remotely look like me, because I don't watch, other than that, you got to look at period pieces, and see gross misrepresentations, or even if they are accurate, it's just like those people they're all dead now. I don't see myself in any of that. Were there any movies that you grew up and saw yourself in?
Yeah, I mean, the place where I grew up in, obviously I grew up in my tribal community, but we have a long history of relations, and our neighbors and the kids that we went to school with are Spaniard descendants. So whenever a movie that kind of was popular there. It was popular among the public too. So I remember in the early 80s, there was Bad Boys, which had Esai Morales, who was considered the most heartthrob actor among all the girls that I went to school with. My older sister took me to that, and that movie theater was packed with so many different people from both of our communities, both the Pueblo and the Spanish community. And that was a huge event for us. And, to see somebody like Esai Morales on the screen, it was a big deal to us, even though, I'm from a Pueblo community, and he's a descendant of a different community, but that kind of seeing that person on screen, it does speak to us. And I remember going to that movie and thinking it was one of the biggest events of my life, just standing there and seeing, and the movie was not that great. It was just a bunch of gangs fighting against each other. But the fact that he was on the screen and the fact that other people from both of our communities were there, it was a big deal to me at the time. And I was probably about 10 years old.
So take me through your relationship with media and television, and I guess why journalism?
Well,
out of everything that you could have done, why journalism?
So that's so fascinating, because now kids have multiple and infinite and endless choices of what they can view. They can turn on the TV, they can turn on TikTok, they can go to YouTube, they can go to streaming services, they have infinite choices. When I grew up, we had 3 channels. We had ABC, NBC, CBS, and the public station. So when there's not much choice, you have to, and you couldn't record it. We didn't have video cassette recorders at that time. You had to pay attention, and it's almost like passing on a tradition to you. So in Pueblo culture, most everything is transmitted by someone telling you, and you can spend hours and hours listening to somebody, and you have to sit there and listen. So that transmission of knowledge to me, and from my culture, and then watching a television show and having to hear it and having to experience it. And that might have been the only time you ever saw it. So you better pay attention, because you might want to act that scene out. My brothers and sisters, we loved playing TV shows. We loved going outside and pretending like we were the Dukes of Hazzard. So we had to remember the lines. We loved playing Land of the Lost. So we had to remember.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So you had to pay attention. And that kind of transmission of information, I think it's universal among a lot of people. But growing up in that environment where your choices are kind of limited because of where we live, the signals aren't going to come very strongly if people live on a reservation. And, the phone service isn't that widespread. When I grew up, there was no such thing as the internet. So what I grew up watching, you really had to pay attention. And my background has nothing to do with that. That's the funny thing. I once I got into school, I guess a teacher brought in a computer. It was an Apple IIe. It's this honking huge machine. It's probably the size of a refrigerator. And when that teacher brought it in, I was fascinated by a machine that you could type into, and you could create your own knowledge. You could create your own images. You could create your own stories. And yes, it took a lot of work, but that idea was fascinating to me. So I always knew I wanted to do something with computers. So when I went to college, my major was electrical engineering and computer science. Had nothing to do with with media, nothing to do with journalism, but this idea of being able to use a tool that I can choose how to represent myself, that really spoke to me. So when the World Wide Web was invented, which was around 1994, 1995, and I got involved in that, I was able to say, this is my story, and I'm able to tell it in the way that I want to tell it. And I was in USA Today, for all people. I was as a senior in college. They put me in USA Today as being a quote internet pioneer, and I'm like, why am I in USA Today for putting up a couple of web pages? But that really is where this idea of sharing stories from a Native perspective came from. Was that long tradition to me, and that's where it comes from. It doesn't necessarily come from me saying, oh, I'm going to go into this XYZ field. It just comes from feeling in my being that this is what I want to do. And now we can disseminate information among many channels. There used to be a page on a website where you could see almost every website in existence. You could go to that page and there were only 20 new websites a
My
day.
gosh.
So you could actually visit them all.
That's
So
crazy.
now the fact that anybody can do that is such an amazing thing. And the fact that, Native kids are on TikTok and doing their thing, that's amazing. That's incredible. So I love the fact that it's grown, and there are many different ways that Native people can express themselves. There's, Native people on YouTube. There's the Navajos React guys. I mean, they have a huge following. That is amazing. And so to see that one of their videos gets hundreds of thousands of views and they're just being themselves, that is amazing.
So I think, you beautifully brought it all full circle without me having to lead you. So this is great. Natives React. So total plug on the show. We were featured on on their latest episode when we talked about Natives React to Hollywood, and my interview with Natalie Benali, who plays Dory in the Navajo dubbed version of Finding Nemo. A snippet of that interview was featured in there, and I thank him for that tremendously because it helped the show. It helped visibility to the show. But I think more importantly, it just I saw so much of my common thoughts in that show, and people just being goofy and featuring what people are talking about today, not 20 years ago, using highlighting meme culture, highlighting TikTok videos where people are blending really scenes from old movies like Predator, Dances with Wolves, and blending it with current language with how we talk today. That's awesome. I think Natives React is great because it's who we really are today. And I think it's akin to, it's really just it's akin to what you did, Indians.com, of just I don't see myself, I don't see my voice represented, so I'm just going to do this. And I'm sure Patrick is a Navajo, who's the YouTube channel. I don't think he envisioned that he would be creating videos that would get, 500,000, 250,000 views, but it's awesome that he does. And I think it's a testament to, we just are starving for something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of sad on one hand that it's taken this long, 20 years for these people to gain more, visibility. But I think it's great because we're doing it in the way we want to do. And,
right.
One of the things that is common among our people is humor. You can't go anywhere and be among a gathering, whether it's a feast in a Pueblo place or, a gathering at a conference. We're just laughing and having fun. And that's why Natives React is so great. They're just doing what we always do. We sit around, we laugh, and we have fun. And being able to show that to other people, I think that is what the draw is. And because nobody, like you're saying, if you're presenting something to them that nobody else is seeing, they're going to want to see it.
Right. And I think the cool thing is, what I love about my show and what I love about Natives React is it's not for everybody. And I think that's the problem with some of the representation. It's well, we have this pressure because there's so few opportunities to see representation of just we get one shot to tell this story. So let's tell it that it can please everyone. It's you shouldn't have to do that. And my show isn't for everybody. If you don't like film, you don't like to hear a Native's perspective on film. And even if you like those two things, you might not like my voice. You might not like my perspective, my particular take on things, but that's okay. I think the beauty of today's age is it's really essentially what you're saying is the availability to put yourself out there and to share a perspective it's like it's never been before. And in 10 years, who knows what that's going to look like. And I think it's exciting for representation, frankly, and language revitalization. And just across the board, you can check the box of all these things could vastly improve with the advances in technology that we have today.
Yeah, that's so true. And especially now under COVID, when schools aren't in session and kids have to learn through their computers. And I think that can really help with something like learning culture. I was watching a conference earlier this week where a group by the Navajo Nation, they had to retool everything because of COVID. They had to get supplies to their students at home and teach them stuff they would have taught them in person, but over Zoom. And you know what? They're succeeding. And they're having other groups come to them and ask them, how did you do this? So we adapt easily. And that's the one thing that's also common among Native people. We adapt.
Completely agree.
Yeah, we're able to take the parts that are good that we feel fit with ourselves. And it always comes from ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we're able to do that. And what does hinder that is the inability of other governments and the other people to say, well, in order to help you get there, we need to uphold the promises. So like getting broadband, that's something that has taken 2 decades to do, and we're not even anywhere near there.
Right.
And so when kids need to be learning and they don't have that ability to connect, they have to drive around and find that signal, and that's hindering their ability to express themselves.
It's really it's testament to the institutionalized racism in this country that's cemented in the policy. When you look at my reservation, a third of the reservation, my Navajo res doesn't have access to running water because there's a lot of like freeze allotment kind of issue, or freeze land freeze issues where like you can't develop on any of these like parsecs of land. Specifically, you call it the Bennett freeze, but there's these like parsecs of land where you're not allowed to develop for whatever reason. And so like if you live there, you're landlocked, you're screwed. You got to haul your water, you got to do this, and that's water. And I'm glad you brought up broadband, because that now is like an essential utility to live your life, because that's in the future. I really think that office spaces are just going to get smaller and smaller and eventually go away. Like we're going to have these common like WeWork spaces almost, where it's going to be like common spaces, because I think corporations will wise up to the fact like, hey, I don't need to have this multi-million-dollar facility. Why would I have that affect my bottom line when I could have these people work from home? And that's going to put Native people at a disadvantage if we don't have adequate access to broadband internet.
Yeah, and if we're not in the room when all these conversations occur, because that person can't get to the office to connect,
right.
We're going to be left behind. So a lot of the being in Washington D.C., I pre-COVID, I was able to go to hearings in person. Now those hearings aren't in person. So a person that would normally be asked to testify, say in rural Alaska, now they're being asked to testify over a link that may not be the greatest. So their message might be lost, or they might not be asked, period, because they say, well, we can't get a reliable signal out here. And I've even seen, a tribal leader in Washington had that issue, in outside of Seattle. If you're in a certain area of the reservation and your signal's bad, you can't present that testimony that people need to hear. That's just a fact of life. It
would bother us so much to like our Navajo Nation president. He was getting roasted on social media because he was, obviously he's the face of the franchise. He's the face of the Navajo Nation with all of our COVID responses and our response to COVID across the nation. And he would be sitting in his room with like the worst. It's just like, out of all the millions of dollars we have available, we can't have someone go on to Amazon and buy a ring light. We can't have someone go and buy him like a good microphone for his laptop. We can't like get him a satellite, internet. Like he just had choppy internet. Like it looked like he was sitting, I don't know, like he was in a college dorm. Like the lighting was terrible. It was just like, gosh, man.
But he had the Navajo flag in the background.
He did. Yeah, of all the things that was that's the last thing I wanted, to be in there. But really,
I've seen tribal leaders testify and call into Zooms from their cars, because if you're at home and you're taking care of your family and it might be a little loud, you have to go outside and do it from your car.
And people seeing that too, like that really does not add any credibility to us. If that's televised, if that's recorded, and they're like, what kind of like tribal nation? Like to me, that was like the thing I first thought of, is just quality for quality. That's why like I try to take pride in I didn't start my podcast for a while because I wanted to make sure the audio was somewhat respectable. When you juxtapose it against just a regular podcast show. Because if you're recording it from your cell phone and you're trying to have these conversations of representation, like the message is clouded by the quality of the delivery. And I think that hurts me the most when we have tribal leaders trying to advocate for change and on our behalf, and really people just kind of like consumed by the surroundings and are just like, oh, look at those poor natives. Look at the conditions they have to live in. And then our message gets lost.
Yeah, that's definitely something that people have to worry about is, it's almost on both extremes. If you have somebody that seems to come from a community that has everything, they're almost questioning you. They almost say, well, you're too successful. We don't need to hear from you anymore.
Right.
That's in the probably early 2000s, there was a very concerted effort by members of Congress, even from states that you wouldn't associate as being, right wing, saying that if your tribe is wealthy, your relationship shouldn't matter. Your government to government relationship isn't as important as another tribe's, and that's so offensive to say, oh, just because someone is successful, that they're not a tribe anymore. And that was an argument that was pushed very hard. And fortunately, it didn't go anywhere because that would require a lot of changes to a lot of things. But that is an idea that people have about us because they do not understand. They don't see us every day. They don't see us on TV at all. The number of roles for Native people has gone down. There's on TV within the past few years. It probably could change soon. But when we first started the website, we had this feature called Native TV. And fortunately, we had a person who went through the listings. This is pre our current age of having 1 million channels. She went through all the listings and found every TV show and every play of a movie that either had a native theme or had a native actor in it.
Oh
and we would run that list.
I would love to have that job.
We would run that list every week. And by me looking over at that list, I could see, well, who was playing what roles and who's being cast in what roles. Now there's no roles. So that person wouldn't have a job today. That person, she'd be, scouring the internet for vague things because there would be almost nothing to put in there.
You'd have to really look for Canada. They have the Aboriginal People's Television Network. And I think that helps them a lot to get their voice out there and tell their stories to a certain extent. But yeah, in the United States, there's nothing. We don't have any of that. The closest thing we got was given to us by Canada, which was Trickster, and that got canceled. There's a whole controversy behind that. But you're absolutely right. There is no, even when there are natives on television, they cast people that are ambiguously, what's the way? They're ethnically ambiguous, so they could pass for multiple races, and they're like, close enough, that's a native, and they just put you on camera.
Yeah, so I was in this app called Clubhouse, which a lot of people are joining now, and the room was talking. It was a lot about a lot of issues, but one of the former Miss Alaska, she actually was in this chat, and she was saying, she's a Hispanic woman. She's a proud Mexican descendant, but she said she would go to Hollywood and they would try to cast her as Asian.
Wow.
And she would say, I'm not going to let you cast me as Asian. So she stood up, but because of her having conviction and a principle, she's not getting jobs. That's just a sad reality of a casting agent saying, you have the look that I want. And it's that ambiguous look because you could be anybody.
And you don't look native to me, even though you're native. And my Natalie Benali interview, she said the exact same thing you just said. The exact same thing. When they said, we don't have any native roles for your look, but we have these other ethnically ambiguous roles that you can take. And she said that they were pretty much pitching her Asian roles. And she's like, I'm not going to do that. And what does she do now? She's not in Hollywood. She's not getting work over there because she refused to make that leap. And that just contradicted her moral fiber. She's like, I can't do that. I became an actor to represent who I am. That's not who I am. And unless you're willing to make those leaps at certain points in your career to where you can finally get the opportunity to play the roles that you want, like it's a slippery slope too. You could go down that path of ethnically ambiguous, and then pretty soon you're known as the, stand-in Mexican guy, even though you're, Navajo. So it's problematic.
I don't fault the person for accepting a role to get a job because we've all got to eat, and wouldn't fault that person.
Yeah,
but
same here. I would never ever say, I would never condemn that behavior for the same exact reason. It's just like, hey, who wouldn't? I mean, if you give me the opportunity, hey, Ian, here's a potential for you to make $20,000 for 2 months of work. but you got to play a Mexican guy. And I'm like, gosh, did you say $20,000?
Yeah.
All right,
Oh,
all right, it's fine. It's just 2 months. It's 2 months. I'll make it work. I'll make it work. And then you do that enough times, and you just I can totally see it. And 20,000, that's just a made up number. But it's like, especially. So I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I was just saying that's such a common thing I've heard from people who did try to make it in Hollywood. The sad fact is that the people who are in charge are non-natives, and they don't know anything about us, and so they're basing their decisions on what is palatable to non-natives. So they say, oh, such and such story won't sell, such and such actor won't be seen as sellable in this role, and that system perpetuates over and over and over. And it's not just in Hollywood; it's in books and literature. We don't have native authors.
It's in comedy. It's exactly what you're saying. It's across the board, 100%.
Everywhere, yeah. So it's just so many levels that the only way to break into it is for us to start doing it ourselves, which is why this democratization of the internet is helpful for us. But at the same time, you have to go a step further, and that's where people, I think, are now. Obviously, if you are a successful YouTuber, you can monetize your channel and get money off of that way. But then what's the next step? That person ideally should say, well, I want to do more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something we all have to ask ourselves is, can I do more? And am I doing more?
What I know for a fact is it's all about the bottom line. When for any corporation that stands and like, well, we take this stance on social justice. It's like, couldn't you just do that and not publicize it? You're doing that to try to affect your bottom line because you want people to know you're on the right side of whatever issue is the perceived right side of whatever issue you're getting out. I would love to see a reality where there's a homegrown YouTube show that is really produced by natives and created by natives, and it gets so much steam behind it that the major networks, they start looking over like, oh, what's going on over there on YouTube? There's like a native sector of YouTube where they're getting millions of views every episode. I think but then it goes back to, they'll just take it and corporatize it, and then they'll be like, oh, we don't, the person that it's just like any band story, it's like, well, I love that you guys, I love your sound. You can, but the lead singer is what is the character of your group. We can change your drummer, right? We can change your outfits. We can change this and we can change that to fit our look, to fit our template of what we push out. But I think that's the future is I just love like real res produce. Like there's this Boney War Pony on YouTube. It's just these like really res kind of productions where he's just talking about being a res kid on the Navajo Nation, and it's not for everybody. But if you're a res kid from the Navajo Nation or just like that res experience, like it's great. It's great. And I hope to see more of stuff like that, to where it's just like, you don't need to be in Hollywood to make a living. You don't need to live in LA to make a living. You can just need a good camera, a decent knowledge of like how to understand and make films, and put your stuff out on YouTube. And if there's enough people that are starving for your message, starving for your content, like they'll find you. And I think that's the greatest thing about the internet right now. And it's the most exciting thing for me in representation.
Yeah, that's such a big deal. In New Mexico, there was a late Navajo lawmaker, John Pinto, and he was big on education and getting those tools to younger people. And so the film program is actually named after him now. So the film program helps people in Pueblo Navajo communities become filmmakers in the way that they want to become filmmakers. We shouldn't impose somebody else's system of what they believe is good film on somebody. They're going to decide for themselves, and you know what? They're going to succeed, because a lot of these kids that I'm seeing on TikTok, they're doing it the way they want, and it's amazing to watch them.
And so many YouTubers eventually, just because they have so much of that popularity and people have that recognition of their face, they're like, hey, we can market that. That could totally happen to natives. They're just like, hey, let's put them in a TV show or in a commercial. And because that happens all the time with YouTube, YouTube stars, YouTube creators. I just don't know where. It'll be interesting to see that its next evolution of representation as we try to take control of more of our own stories. As a journalist, where do you think we are? You kind of have like a very high level view. You're panned out of like higher level view of like the overall landscape. I'm just a podcaster. I only see what I'm looking at, but you see it at a much higher level. Like, where is representation at, like, compared to 20 years ago?
All right. Obviously, I think it's improved, but I think in terms of the mainstream media, they're stuck, and they're stuck because they don't recognize really the history of how we ended up here. And to really accurately report on some things that are happening to tribes, you have to take an Indian law class, and that's just something someone should do, and it really helps. But are people in the mainstream doing that? No. The New York Times did a terrible job initially when the Supreme Court last June confirmed that the reservation of the Creek Nation still exists, and that reservation is about 3 million acres. The New York Times headline said that half of Oklahoma was Indian country, and that's not what the Supreme Court said. Is that maybe a next logical conclusion, perhaps, but that's not what the decision said. And that would have never happened with another court case. They would not have, that type of headline and reporting would not have been allowed on a case such as maybe relating to the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare or something about religious freedom. That wouldn't have happened, but because it's an issue, it's because it's about Indian country, that gets passed. So, those kind of things are still a problem. And the New York Times, I hate to bring them up again, but in the late December, the first person that they published talking about Deb Haaland, who's making history as the first Native person to be nominated as the Secretary of the Interior, was a non-Native woman. And they never checked the person's credentials. It took them a month to realize this person lied to us, and they didn't even actually print an apology. It just was a kind of a clarification on who this person was, and that person was lying to them. So if you take those kind of metrics, it almost seems like we've gone backwards. Instead of choosing a Native person to talk about Native issues, they actually chose a non-Native person to talk about Native issues. So there are instances where it does look like we haven't moved one single bit. So they followed that up by publishing Jody Gillette, who's an amazing Native woman. She's Standing Rock, and she published about something that we talked about earlier, which is the loss of language amid COVID. But that's kind of late. They kind of screwed up the first time. So, we see a lot of things in the mainstream media where they have to kind of make a fake apology and then cover their tracks and act like nothing happened. And to this day, you can't get an answer out of the New York Times why they will not vet someone who says they're Native or not. They just won't do it. The only answer that I have gotten in my reporting is the Styles editor will confirm whether a subject in a story is a citizen of a state or federally recognized tribe. So that editor is obviously knows something more than a lot of other editors there. But the other editors, they won't answer the question. They won't even tell you what they're thinking. If we want to look just at one major media institution, it looks like we've lost ground. But in other areas, I think it's been gained. So last summer,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so last summer with the Supreme Court case, there was a amazing podcast done by a Cherokee woman, Rebecca Nabel. She's a Cherokee journalist. She focused on how we got to the Supreme Court case in the first place. And she was promoted by Crooked Media, which is a non-Native owned podcast company. So in some instances, you can say there's been gains. In some instances, I think you can say nothing's happened.
But unless you're at your level, or I don't want to say I'm at anybody's level that's different, but I'm at least looking into it intentionally. I can see there's progress. But if you're just an everyday casual viewer, you can see that. So I wanted your perspective to have you highlight that, because it's like when you really get down into the weeds and you start paying attention, you start digging for stories, you're like, oh, there's tons of wins. There's tons of things to be excited about. But if you're a casual viewer, especially a non-Native person, you're a casual viewer, you're like, man, nothing has changed in the past 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah, and this kind of ties in, something that we talked about earlier, about Native people taking something that could be the worst and making fun of it and making it part of us. And that's what happened after the election. CNN ran their infamous graphic that called everybody who was not white or black something else.
Mm-hmm.
And so over the next 2 weeks on TikTok and on Twitter, you saw so many hilarious memes about something else.
Yep.
There's great videos on TikTok of someone saying, hey, are you a Native? And that person would say, no, I'm something else. And that's just hilarious. So, there are ways that, we are taking the negativity and saying,
Yep.
we're making fun of it.
Even with Bernie Sanders, and he was Grandpa Bernie, Uncle Bernie, when he was sitting at the inauguration. My favorite was when they would put down like a Pendleton and basketball, like, to make it look like he was sitting in the basketball bleachers, like sitting on a Pendleton blanket. I love that. Or sitting in the parade route, waiting for the parade to start. I loved it, and I think that's 20 years ago. I think it's amazing to even imagine like that we would ever be here. It's so hard to, the fish is always the last to know water. It's so hard to understand now, like how far we've come when you look back. When you got started in journalism, if you could have thought like, oh, things are going to go viral just among Indian country, and we're going to re-represent how the media is spinning us in a negative fashion, and we're all going to laugh about it. Like, if you just said that, you're like, oh my God, is that Wakanda you're describing? Like, that's amazing. What kind of future is that? But I think we sometimes need to take a step back and appreciate how far we have come and start looking for things like Indians.com, start looking for places that are reporting accurately, but also digging into the stories that matter in Indian country, and not just the super high level and giving a snapshot of it and then never talking about us again until something negative happens.
Yeah, that's so true. And like you were saying, I couldn't have imagined that. I would have never thought there would be a day where there'd be thousands of Native people making fun of something else. I would have never imagined that. So it's great.
It's awesome. And I want to bring up one last thing before we sign off, but before we finish this up. I love this because there's finally an article written about something that I'm interested in. It's Native film and television. There's an article on Indians.com from August of last year titled "Who Will Play an Osage Woman in a Film About the Osage People? Killers of the Flower Moon set to begin production in 2021 in a new deal with Apple." So I'm not going to go over the whole article, but I think that's just a great thing for us to start talking about, of like, who is going to play this Native person in this upcoming role about Natives, and have that before instead of afterwards when it comes out, or after it's, as it's being produced. Like, I think that's a win right there, because we could potentially stop something from being problematic. And even afterwards, if there's enough steam behind it and people are outraged, the studios will go and fix it. Prime example is Sonic the Hedgehog. People hated how his eyes were going to look because it wasn't representative of the video game. And what did the studio do? They stopped it. They redid the whole movie, and they re-rendered his eyes to make it look like it was in the video game. And then people went and watched it afterwards. So I think it's a good opportunity for us to start getting ahead of these things. So I love that article.
Yeah, and the reason that article, I think, succeeded is because it came from the Osage point of view. The Osage people, that's their story. And sadly, the popular book that it was drawn from was written by a non-Native person. And the Osage people have actually produced prior stories about it. There's a documentary about it. There's been books about it written from the Osage point of view. But Hollywood chose to option a book written by a non-Native person. And that non-Native person is nothing, he's not a bad person, not a bad writer. But the fact that we're already set behind, that's a big issue. And that's what the article was speaking to, was who is actually going to play an Osage woman on screen? Is it going to be an ethnically ambiguous person, or is it going to be an actual, real, breathing Native woman? And this week they announced that it's an actual, real, alive Native woman.
Oh, they did. They announced it, huh?
Yes, and I'm a terrible person right now because the story came out in the Osage News, which is the Osage Nation's paper, and they reported that I can't remember her name. So I'm terrible right now. I'm slacking on my job, and but it's a Native woman, and that's the fact that Jim Gray, who wrote that story, he's the former chief of the Osage Nation, and he's an old school journalism person. I mean, he used to run a newspaper. Him relentlessly talking about it, not just to other Native people, but among the Osage people, that really drove where the conversation was. So if the fact that they're going to start filming on the Osage Nation is a big deal. The set headquarters is in Bartlesville, and all the production staff is amassing in Bartlesville right now, and they're going to start producing. There's Osage people on, not only have helped out with the film, but they're on the production staff. They're not just they're doing behind the scenes roles so that when another film comes to town, or maybe they want to go somewhere else and do something there, they're going to have that experience, and it's going to come from something that happened on their own lands, and that is amazing.
I love that. And I just looked it up. Lily Gladstone.
Yeah, Lily Gladstone. Yeah, she's Blackfeet.
Yep. So it's confirmed. You heard it here, people. Go check that out. Initially, when I first heard it was a Martin Scorsese film, has Robert De Niro in it, has DiCaprio in it. I'm like, yikes! That's a lot of money. That's a lot of star power. They're going to be real selective about who they let in. But I'm happy they let in Lily Gladstone. That's awesome.
Yeah. So the backstory to that is what happened to those Osage people was terrible. It kind of led to the formation of a Federal Bureau of Investigation because there was a lack of jurisdiction. There was a jurisdictional loophole about who is going to investigate crimes on Indian country. And the story initially was going to be about the FBI agent. And I guess Leonardo DiCaprio is too old to play that guy now. Leonardo DiCaprio is probably he's in his late 40s maybe now.
Early 50s.
And
maybe,
so then he kind of rewrote the story to focus more on the family side. And that's why it's so important to have a Native woman play a Native woman, because
that's great.
That is where the story's going. And I think that's what's going to make that film a better film, because the Osage people have been talking to Martin Scorsese. He came to Osage country and asked them. And hopefully he listened, and hopefully if he isn't listening now, and as the movie is produced, they're going to tell him, because they're going to be on set with him. They're going to be at the table.
Well, and if nothing else, we'll roast that movie when it comes out to streaming on Netflix or on video on demand. So, I mean, they'll hear it one way or another, either during production or afterwards. And I'm so happy that we had this conversation, Acee. This was a good conversation. I hope to bring you back on at some point just to talk more about news, because man, you got your ear to the ground. You really have like a pulse on like all the happenings, and I think it's unfortunate that we don't have access to that much information on a regular basis, and we just get fed mainstream media. So while I close out, I'll just say this: go to Indians.com, Indians with a Z, because you will find articles like the one I just mentioned about will the Osage woman actually play in the role of about Osage people, about an Osage woman. So go check out Indians.com and you won't be disappointed. Thank you, Acee, for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.